Epstein, and this is The Dispatch. Broadway is in crisis, real crisis, as is New York City. And will it rebound? Can it rebound? What will that look like? I had the opportunity to interview Peter Marks, chief theater critic of the Washington Post, on this subject. He wrote a fabulous front-page piece back in September discussing Broadway's relationship to New York. The economy, small businesses, hotels, tourism, and the like. Peter and I had a lively, informative conversation, and I'm pleased to welcome him as my first guest here on The Dispatch.
Peter Marks, welcome to The Dispatch.
It's great to be here, Adam.
You are my inaugural guest.
I am so honored. You have no idea.
No, I'm honored to have you. I want dispatchers to know Peter threads an important needle, having worked for most of his life in theater, but also in politics, covering the George W. Bush campaign for the New York Times, and of course, currently serving as the chief theater critic of the Washington Post. And on that note, on September 8th, you wrote a big piece, which is the subject of today's broadcast. For dispatchers know that I try to weave politics and culture, at least that's what I promise, Peter. And New York City can't rebound without Broadway, reads the headline. And Broadway's road back is uncertain. This was a big piece. You interviewed really everybody and anybody on Broadway in and around the industry. Of course, I am a former Broadway producer myself. I still have a very special place in my heart for the Rialto, as they used to call it. Peter, the first thing I want to talk about is, people think of the arts in crisis in this very abstract way, right? They say, poor theater, poor movies, poor concerts, kind of lump everything together. But Broadway is a very specific place because it's about New York City, which is also a very specific place. Right. So just to jump into it, Broadway is the lifeblood of the city. Can you give us an overview of how damaging Broadway's closure really is, not just for the artist, but for Manhattan?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And as you know from your own esteemed work as a producer for a Tony-winning musical, you have great stature in the business I cover. But as for how that business is suffering, well, think of it this way. Broadway is a $15 billion a year generator of revenue in the city of New York. It contributes about 4% of the total tax base. It's 4.5, I think it is. Right. It's 100,000 jobs. It's a ecosystem that fans out from Times Square, which is sort of the heart of the city, to an endless array of restaurants, hotels, cabarets, you name it, souvenir stores. This is a small business mecca. These are hundreds of small businesses that serve Broadway: tailors, shoemakers, every kind of set builders. There are blue collar workers, stagehands. It's thousands and thousands of people, thousands of working Americans. Yeah. So it's no different than any other company town. The way Detroit is for auto workers, for Hollywood is in the film industry. These things are not just for the elite.
Right. It's interesting because, the image of Broadway, like anything Hollywood or the music industry, is glamour. And, you're describing Main Street. You're describing an industry that feels like a Main Street industry, right? The work of the cobbler and the designer and the local shopkeeper, which, of course, people don't realize all goes into Broadway. I mean, one thing we should talk about, or mention at least, going to a Broadway show has largely become an external to New York thing. So in other words, what I mean by that is that going to Broadway, well, even when you're in the city, but when you come in, you get a hotel, you go to dinner, you take in the city, and you go to a show. All of that. You take a taxi, you take an Uber,
correct,
whatever. So everything, like you said, is this internal ecosystem. And so the question becomes, does Broadway struggle to rebound? Well, it is struggling to rebound, but as it struggles to rebound, what's sort of the economic outlook for those industries? Like, what does the costume designer do? And what is forget the actors for a second, is there sort of a general dread, or is there an optimism? Yes. Is there, in terms of timeline, what are we talking about?
They're going away. They're going away.
They're going out of business. A lot of places.
They have no revenue. The income is gone. And remember also, let's just set the table completely. This radiates out all across the country because the work that's generated on Broadway ends up in theaters in every major city and medium-sized city in the country.
Very good point. I just want to tell people that, when a Broadway show is successful, Broadway musical like Hairspray, which I produced, or take any hit show, any tentpole as they call it in Hollywood, right? Regional theaters and amateur houses and camps and stock companies are doing those shows everywhere, and they are closed.
Correct.
So it's effect. They're not only doing that, they're closed permanently, but a lot of them hinge their seasons on being able to do Grease or Annie or
And imagine this. Yeah. Hilton Hotels. There's a Hilton Hotel in Times Square that just announced it's closing for good.
That's not the one on 6th Avenue.
No, it's on 42nd Street. It's right on 42nd between 7th and 8th Avenues. But just imagine, if you will, a more American brand name than Hilton, a more solid. It's got to be the Cadillac, Pontiac, American-made hotelier that we all know best, and they can't even make a go of it now. And the prospects are pretty bleak. So it's a very, it's rock bottom. It's the bedrock of the economy here.
People have to know, I guess I might call it, the penumbral effect of this, a sort of external grounding kind of effect that this has. And to the point of the shows themselves, having worked in the industry, when I retired from Broadway in 2008, you might say that the average running cost, people don't know this, forget what they see in Variety or wherever grosses are reported, it's about $500,000 to $700,000 a week to run the show. That is your break even. That's what you call the nut. So what that means is, people know, is you got to sell that many tickets at base to make your payments, and then on top of that running cost, sometimes it's included, sometimes it's not, are the royalty payments to the creatives, producers included, writer, director, designers, and advertising and marketing every week to keep these shows afloat. Broadway was booming in the sense of people were returning, all the theaters were filled, but hit shows are still hit shows. The statistics, I just want to be clear. I read a lot of articles that I think are misguided in the coverage of the theater when they say Broadway is everybody's making money. That's not necessarily true. It's still about 1 in 7 recoup, and you're really lucky if you have profit. Really, the odds are the same. Now that they're facing a precipice, and not just because they haven't opened, but when they reopen. And I say this, and I'm hoping to have people from the unions on and both sides of the aisle, as we say. Are people prepared to make economic sacrifices if Broadway's a slow burn? I mean everybody. Are they really talking about doing the work? Because when I was there, I thought they needed a wholesale economic reintegration. I didn't want it to happen this way, but this is a distressed moment, which I think is ripe for innovation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, let's just let people know, first of all, that Broadway is a tourist destination. 70% of the tickets sold on Broadway are to people from out of town, and I mean either other parts of the country or other parts of the world. And those people have to come back to New York, with no COVID restrictions, essentially, before that can actually happen. The other thing to remember is that ticket prices on Broadway are astronomical and scary. $250 is not an unusual price, and obviously everybody's heard the stories about Hamilton, which went up to $800 or something.
That's the gold mine example,
right? There's just the beginnings of an understanding, I would say, among people on Broadway that there are going to have to be a wholesale rethinking, at least at first, of how people are, how the economic system works. Right. And unions are not grasping this quite yet, or they're not grappling with it yet. There has been no proposal made. Remember, it's a unionized business. It's a very heavily unionized labor force.
Well, and I need to be on the record. I'm very supportive of that, but it does. It still, shows are still produced largely, and they're absolutely a corporate influence by small business people who, right. Yes, if you have a hit, you do very well, but most of the time you're raising money you're not trying to ask 50 people about
Right. They're essentially each a small business. They're a limited corporation. Right. Each new show, except for the cases of Disney, which produces The Lion King and Aladdin on Broadway.
It's its own company, the hairspray company.
They're small businessmen. I mean, they're middle-sized businessmen.
When you say unions, it's not unions versus producers. People often think that producers are Walmart or Amazon.
Right,
not.
No.
And weathering the storm is really dependent upon how much money you don't have at risk.
True. You have a producer's perspective on that. I will say, though, on the other hand, that there are many work rules that are imposed on the labor forces of Broadway that are pretty draconian, and I don't think that I wouldn't say that for the most part, I would not say you could call Broadway actors overpaid.
No. And they're not an actors' equity. In my years on the Broadway League, when I was on actually the Government Relations Committee, and I, for a brief time, was on labor, was actually often voted in favor of their pay raises. And they are not what is responsible for the cost structure. And listen, their work is never steady. And unlike, the IATSE union or the stagehands union and the theater owners, they're really the ones that make away with the lion's share of the money.
Well, there you go. And you've just put your finger on the pulse here, which is the thing that's not mentioned and people don't understand is that producers are merely tenants in these buildings that are owned predominantly, these 41 Broadway theaters the majority of them are owned by 3 landlords. Yeah, the Schuberts, the Nederlanders, and a company called Jamson, owned by a rich real estate magnate right now.
Run by Rocco Landesman, appointed to head the NEA by Rocco.
Yeah, he sold it. I mean, they sold. Right. Right. No, but those 3, those are they have the stranglehold on the expenses on Broadway. I mean, it's not cheap to run a theater, no doubt. But if there's going to be a overhaul of the relationships, it's got to start with, I think, the landlords and how they hold the feet to the producers to the fire.
Yeah, and I want to go to your piece because this is, I thought, an important thing, very important point. And talking about COVID, I'm just going to read part of it. The timetable in terms of reopening. The timetable hinges on advances in detection and prevention of the coronavirus via development of rapid testing and vaccines. Well, that's obviously the nationwide problem, is when are we going to have a widespread vaccine to do everything we once did? Okay, but you go on. And this is so important for people to understand. These are crucial in the commercial domain of Broadway, where social distancing is an untenable remedy for multi-million-dollar productions that require, and this is key, folks, ex-producer talking, but this applies to everybody's pay, where multi-million-dollar productions that require their 1,000 to 2,000 seat spaces to be filled to near capacity to be profitable, right? And you go on, museum directors like Adam Weinberg of the Whitney say they have been able to demonstrate their air filtration systems and crowd control procedures are adequate, but performance venues, meaning the Gershwin Theater, the Schubert, all these theaters have not. The reason that's crucial is the sort of gradual reopening of restaurants. Not obviously in Times Square, well, maybe now, but certainly in LA where I am, outdoor seating, if they have big enough patio. Restaurants too, like theater, are on razor-thin margins, but many of them have been able, though they're struggling, because I always speak to the owners, at a 25% margin, which I think is kind of what their margin is anyway, don't they? Basically. So they've told me. Broadway's 80%, it costs you to break even on a show pretty much. So what I'm getting at is that you can't do, notwithstanding the lovely Godspell I hear about in the Berkshires, right, where everybody's plexiglass and there's space. That's lovely. That's communitarian. That's like somebody's kibbutz theater. I'm happy they're doing it. Well, it is. But if you go and pay this kind of money and said you have to, Broadway has no give on its margins. So that's the rub, and that means that if you're not filling it to capacity, everything's shut down again, right? If they get it wrong, right, because they open up, they can't say, oh, we're going to do 30% capacity and sit people. I'm not aware of a model that exists. Do you have any insight on that? Have they said what? I mean, does everybody just think they're just going to open up and like it's going to be booming? I mean, I'm just curious. I don't know.
No. There's an understanding. If you talk to these producers, these big time producers, there's and that's another key factor is that it's going to be a very gradual return to profitability. That a lot of these shows that open, the ones you've heard of, and some you haven't heard of because there'll be new things coming in, hopefully. It will take them weeks and weeks and weeks to sell enough tickets and to have the kind of clientele base that are going to be able to be large enough to fill all the seats. So you're going to have many things running at a loss, essentially. These are like businesses that have overhead that aren't selling their inventory. Any business. The same problem. If you don't sell enough, you're not going to make back enough to make money.
Is there a staggered approach being contemplated?
There's a belief. I mean, listen. Broadway is the land of make believe, and I think some of them make.
No, Peter, don't say that.
So some of the make believe is like magical thinking. I think about how this is all going to happen.
Well, by the way, because Broadway is always in defiance of common sense and mathematics.
Correct.
Now we're in a crisis, so now you're really a manifestation.
No sane human being invests in Broadway shows, really. I mean,
That's something, when I used to raise money, I learned this from a very wise businessman years ago. Never got in trouble. People would say, is this going to do well? And I'd say, prepare for total loss.
Right.
And I would say that I didn't want to get sued. And also, I wanted to say, look, you are in Vegas. You're betting on me, but sometimes... more often than not, the best producers, Cameron McIntosh, Hal Prince, have a strength costume.
Right. The only person who, if you're Max Bialystock, in the producers, that's how you make money. Cheat the people and keep their money. Otherwise, you're gonna
under investigation. We didn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but don't expect to make money on Broadway. It just doesn't. It's not a good bet, as you've pointed out. So all that said. The prognosis is for a sustained period, and this is the scary part because Broadway shows are also not always totally financed well when they go to Broadway. There is a hope that you'll generate a lot of sales through superb reviews, great word of mouth up front, and that will sustain you.
They're counting
exactly. They count on it.
Most rave, Peter,
which is insane because I got a C in economics. So don't count on me, man.
Yeah, but you got an A+ in theater judgment.
Well, thank you. That is very sweet. We just have similar tastes, Adam. I think many times.
No, but I mean, your review you're right. I mean, especially with a play or something vulnerable, you come in. Most shows are undercapitalized. You're right. They're on razors, and they're always saying, "Well, this one's great," or "It comes in from London," or "We've got this." Waiting for when you sat in the chair at the Times or currently in your current position that it could be mixed. It could be now. You're not the only factor anymore.
Of course. Oh no. Exactly. Social media is huge.
All of this wishful thinking that goes into. Correct.
And this is part of the matrix of problems that makes the reopening of Broadway so much more difficult than, say, reopening the Metropolitan Museum of Art or, any museum.
What's the key difference with those not-for-profit cultural institutions in Broadway?
Well, because they're not existing purely on a revenue, an earned revenue model.
Philanthropy.
They have donors, people with tons of money who want to see these institutions survive, and they sustain them through the hard times. I mean, they're all laying off employees, these big cultural institutions, because even they're suffering. But you can also, for example, in a museum, you don't have to have 1,000 people crowded into one gallery. You can time them through, which I've done already at the Met. And it's a very pleasant experience, in masks.
More pleasant. You have more space. You don't.
Well, that's the irony, isn't it?
But I mean, it seems a very intimate. I hate when they
Right.
jam in those lines and all.
No, I know. There's nothing worse than.
But not to get off the topic.
Yeah. I agree.
So my so knowing all this, do we have? And again, you're on the record because you're on the show, but you're not on the record. A sense of a timeline.
Right.
What people? I see what you've reported here.
Yeah.
I see several former colleagues of mine saying we have to come back. We have to gird our loins. That's well and good, but what's the real story here?
The public story is spring. Privately, I think everybody thinks a year from now, at best. I don't.
October-ish, 2021, September, something like that.
Yeah, there's the potential. There are a few shows that have been announced for April and May. Hugh Jackman in The Music Man, and Sarah Jessica Parker and her husband Matthew Broderick in a revival of Neil Simon's Plaza Suite, which are both sort of old school Broadway.
There is authentic reason to believe that those shows will open ahead of other shows?
No. I don't think so. Again, they can't, there's not going to be socially distanced viewing. And are we really thinking that we're all going to be sitting elbow to elbow in theaters in March? Put your head around that. It's not,
Also, something like Hugh Jackman in The Music Man, which in ordinary times is a massive seller. What are you going to do? You're going to tell people you're going to start. You would have to change the schedule. You'd have to distance it out. You have people who are clamoring for the 1,600 seats in the Winter Garden that are going to be told, no, there's only 700 of you. What happens
right.
to I don't know what you do.
No. And you're not going to have Hugh Jackman sing, you got trouble to 11 people. It's not going to happen. That is not going to happen. It's got to be, look. The other part of Broadway is, whenever a movie is done in which they show a Broadway audience, they do not show scattered people around a theater. They show a packed, buoyant crowd. That energy is the essential aspect of theater on that scale. It is not an intimate experience. It is a communal experience on a scale that generates a level of exhilaration, adrenaline, that feeds the evening. And without that, that is not going to be happening in 6 months. We are not there unless God descends with a vaccine or Fauci.
Yes, but by all accounts, Dr. Fauci's been on the record saying that a vaccine which could be ready by the end of this year, beginning of next year, won't be available in any widespread fashion for 6 months or so.
And there's all the run-up time. It's not like the next day crowds will materialize. This is a really slow re-education.
I want to say one more thing that's important, or back to your article. So you point out that there is a bill in Congress that's, weirdly enough, Senator Amy Klobuchar ran for president this past year, Democrat from Minnesota, sponsoring it with John Cornyn of Texas.
It seems unlikely.
Truly one of the arch conservatives who's up for re-election this year in the Senate. The Save Our Stages bill seeking $10 billion relief aid for live venues. So that's not just theater. Does this have any chance, this bill?
Well, there's 100 co-sponsors in the House at this point, more than 100. Remember there are places like Branson, Missouri,
yes,
Vegas.
Oh no.
There are places that have,
the Republicans have
purple and red states that actually do have problems.
Yes.
So Cornyn's Texas, that's Missouri. It's but there must be, I'm not thinking of.
But of this $10 billion, I'm sorry to interrupt you, or $10 billion that they're saying that would be the relief aid. What percentage of that would go to Broadway?
Oh well, that's the question. I don't know. That's all to be figured out, and whether that would go, how much of that would go to commercial producers versus nonprofit institutions, I don't even have any sense.
And commercial theater has so rarely, if ever, been given a lifeline from the government.
The other problem is no one wants to tackle this bill before an election. There's not going to be, and again, who knows what happens after November 3rd. So it's sketchy. Congress has never cared about Broadway.
No, and
in fact, Adam, lobbyists for Broadway. Broadway has hired some lobbyists, and they've told Broadway not to mention Broadway when they come to Washington because no one wants to hear Broadway.
What's New York liberal? It's
it's still considered the 1%.
The 1%. But what's so interesting is that the stimulus bill, the CARES Act, which disproportionately benefited the 1%, right, in this last go around, it measly makes no sense. And then this, right now, we not only don't have a renewal of pandemic compensation of $600, you don't even have another stimulus bill. So this does feel like a loss.
Yeah. And arts workers, is what you have to really call them, not artists, but arts workers are left in the lurch. Completely.
And I feel for everybody, of course, my time on Broadway, I got to work with some of the most wonderful actors and directors, but in the world of acting, and I know this from so many of my friends from Broadway and inside and out, that, there's no side hustle, right? Without everything shut down, not everybody can start a Zoom business teaching how to sing or be a musical theater choreographer. And quite frankly, the waiting jobs and the busboy jobs and the small jobs that you could do, don't exist.
Everybody is moving home to mom and dad.
I heard, and a lot of
I mean, not the 60-year-olds. That would be a little difficult. But the younger people who are the lifeblood, the fresh blood, are giving up. Not giving up. I don't know if that's true, but they are certainly departing for places where they don't have to pay rent.
Yeah, and you know what? On a sentimental note, Peter, I miss the theater terribly. Do I hear an echo?
Oh yeah. Oh totally. Yeah.
Even out here, going to just the idea that when people say you're going to come back to New York, somebody asked me, and I said, to do what? To eat on the sidewalk, and in other words, no shows. I'm not saying nothing's constant anyway. And I'm looking. We're doing this now, 3,000 apart. I want to come when the city is robustly alive, and
I actually live in New York and commute to Washington a lot, back and forth. I do reviews in both cities, and I am happy to say, oddly enough, that on this coming Saturday night, I am going to the Kennedy Center for an indoor concert by Vanessa Williams and Renee Fleming, of all people, for 40 people on the stage of the Opera House. It's going to be live streamed. It's sort of an experiment, all social distance. Are they trying? Yeah. Well, yeah, not like a petri dish. God hope. That's the bad metaphor. But I know, like a test case to see how this all works with all kinds of safety protocols.
Right. Yeah. Well, in these days, I just you're always waiting for some good news. So we hope it's not a petri dish. You're right. A test case.
Exactly.
Litmus test, Peter. Litmus test.
There you go.
Peter, I miss the theater. I certainly miss you, and I miss coming to New York. And I am so glad that you joined us today. I'm really flattered and honored. Your piece is amazing. You're amazing. I'm going to have you back on, and thank you for being, if nothing else, one of Broadway's great champions.
A pleasure, my friend.
I want to thank Peter Marks for joining me here on the Dispatch to discuss all things Broadway. For those of you that want to know more about Peter Marks, and you should, follow him on Twitter at Peter Marks Drama, PeterMarksDrama. Of course, when theater resumes, you'll be able to read Peter's wonderful writing in the Washington Post once the theater finds its footing again. Thank you guys for joining me. I look forward to more guests, more culture, more politics, and everything in between here on the Dispatch.